Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks so much for pushing play. Hey, we've got a fun little roundtable podcast style discussion with no particular agenda in mind to discuss. And on the line is my buddy Rory Hall from SGT Report and the Daily Coin, and Jeff Nielson, who does some writing for Sprott Money and also his own site, Bullion Bulls Canada. First, we'll welcome Rory. How are you, sir?
I'm doing quite well. How are you?
Good. Long time no talk, man.
Yeah, it's been too long.
All right. Well, the world hasn't changed much since we've last spoken. No, changes more in a day than it used to change in a month. And Jeff Nielson, how are you doing, man?
Doing great. The one thing about all these crazy events is it provides a lot of material to work with.
Oh, well, it does. And, just a quick look at the headlines. We see another former Goldmanite becoming Fed president. According to Zero Hedge, Neil Kashkari is replacing Uber Dove Kocher Lakota. I hope I'm saying that right. And of course, it's just more of the same, fascism, corporations, Goldman, Treasury, PIMCO, the Fed. It's the fascist revolving door, isn't it, guys?
Well, I just was looking at a headline this morning from good old B.S. Bernanke popping out of his retirement to suggest that Congress is trying to, quote unquote, bully the Fed, and claiming that the Federal Reserve is not a private bank, and then making the statement that it can operate with little or no capital. You just see these insane statements. And if there was any sort of legitimate media, when remarks were made by a person of this prominence, they would be examined and questioned with a considerable degree of detail. And instead, everything is just glossed over. They can say whatever they want, and nobody ever questions a word of it.
He's trying to make the claim that the Fed is not a private bank?
Although the Federal Reserve is not a private bank and can in fact operate with little or no capital, it's not good optics or good precedent for Congress to be seen as raiding the supposedly independent central bank. And of course, I had a laugh when he calls it supposedly independent, because if it was supposedly independent, could it simply say no when the government of the world's only superpower asks it to do a public audit?
I think
you got to be pretty independent to say no to the U.S. government.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it stands in stark opposition to this quote, which I will now play for everybody, from Alan Greenspan, who famously said,
"What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?"
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
They like to paint the picture of reality through their own lens, right? Reality is what the Fed says it is, guys.
That is true. And not only did Greenspan make that statement, but he also said not too long ago that the United States would never default on any of their obligations because the Fed can just print the money up. So, I mean, these guys are they're so far out of control at this point. It's mind-boggling. And like you pointed out, Jeff, how can any self-respecting person that calls himself a journalist not immediately jump on those statements that Bernanke made to a supposed journalist?
And there's no secret here. The Federal Reserve is owned 100% by its quote-unquote member banks, and
Right.
Those member banks are the big bank tentacles that I refer to as the one bank. So it's as private as any corporation can be, but it's had this quasi-governmental window dressing draped over top of it, and of course we have Bernanke pretending that this veil of a public entity somehow means that it's not a quote-unquote private bank, and that's just total absurdity because it's owned 100% by other private banks.
Mm-hmm. I was on John B. Wells' show, Caravan to Midnight, on Monday night, guys, and I just wanted to sort of take everybody through the history of how we've ended up where we are, right? We're on the verge of economic collapse. We're on the verge of absolute calamity. The U.S. government is now $18.5 trillion in debt with a $19.6 trillion debt ceiling, which I guess the American people will just continue to believe is just going to be raised to infinity, and that there's no problem with that, and that our debtors have no issue with it. When in fact we see from Simon Black over at Sovereign Man this report that the 2015 report of the Social Security and Medicare Board of Trustees states, and I quote, Social Security as a whole, as well as Medicare, cannot sustain projected long-run program costs, and that the government should be, quote, giving the public adequate time to prepare, end quote. Meaning that this debt bubble is going to burst, and these unfunded liabilities, which Lawrence Kotlikoff puts at about $202 trillion, guys, cannot go on forever, cannot be sustained forever. And, what can't go on forever won't.
Well, and here's the part that I don't understand with respect to all of this accounting fraud. We know that the U.S. government has been, quote unquote, borrowing money from itself. All of its supposed, quote unquote, trust funds are being raided again and again, and it's borrowed, quote unquote, trillions of dollars from itself. If any private individual or private corporation tried to do it, it would immediately be branded accounting fraud and you'd be thrown in jail. Mm-hmm. But of course, the U.S. government has its own unique standards for accounting, i.e. there are no standards at all. And so this borrowing, this supposed borrowing it's done internally, has reduced the official national debt by several trillion. I think it's at least 5 trillion, if not more than that, because there were some substantial holdings in some of these public trust funds that it's supposedly managing on behalf of the U.S. public. But my question with respect to Social Security, where it's borrowed trillions out of the Social Security trust fund already, is when we hear these statements about Social Security only being funded until a certain point in time, is it including these supposed loans as part of that funding and pretending that those loans are going to be repaid? Or is it talking about the date that U.S. Social Security implodes because of the fact that these trillions have already been borrowed out of the trust fund? Are either of you guys aware of how the actual accounting works there?
There is no accounting.
Yeah, I think we'd have to ask John Williams and Paul Craig Roberts to put their heads together on that one, Jeff. I mean, who's going to give them the real numbers? Who's going to give them the real, numbers? I mean, you got to remember that when the accounting group that was tasked with finding the $2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon that Rumsfeld admitted to the day before 9/11, when they got busy on trying to track that money down, what is said to be a plane conveniently crashed into the part of the Pentagon in which those people were working. So I don't think the government necessarily wants to let us know what the real deal is and how bad the situation is. But your question's a good one, and the fact of the matter is that this criminal government has been stealing for as long as anyone can remember. The trust fund doesn't even exist. It's just a liability. It's a line item on the national debt sheet.
And the point is that if the official line about when this plan is funded until includes these loans being repaid, then those dates are absolutely fictional. The U.S. government can say, well, it's funded till 2030 or 2050, and in fact, it may run out of money 2 or 3 years from now.
Well, I think they're using young workers to pay for the retirement of old workers. So it's a Ponzi scheme that's collapsing. So to answer your question, I mean, it's stealing from Peter to pay Paul right now. That's how the whole system works. And I don't know, man. I've got two retired parents, and they rely pretty heavily on their Social Security, and I don't think either of them have any idea that the end is near.
What about the fact that no one is buying any of our debt anymore, and the fact that China and Russia, not only are they moving closer together in every single manner that you can think of, but now they are openly discussing gold. And they are openly discussing how to bring their systems closer together by way of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union. These two unions just in themselves represent somewhere north of 50% of the global population. We already know that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization encompasses roughly 70% of the world's natural resources. Now you throw in Russia on top of that, now it grows even larger. And since Russia and China are both members of the BRICS consortium, Where does that even leave the Western world? How does the Western world even function? You've got a stream of lies and propaganda backed by a broke, dead broke nation, rogue nation that is, their business model is war.
Mm-hmm.
And now you have on the other side the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Brazilians and the other people that are attempting to conduct business. Where does that leave the Western world?
Well, Rory, myself, I always frame it in terms of the psychopaths on the one side and the chess players on the other. And so, we see the chess players, Russia and China and some of these other major nations, steadily positioning themselves,
Exactly.
creating these new legitimate institutions which are currently parallel to Western institutions, but where we obviously see them as being replacing these corrupted institutions. And of course, look at the position that this puts the Western crime syndicate in. It has two choices. It can either look to join these new institutions, which is what we've generally been seeing with most of the regimes in this bloc, or they can refuse to join these new institutions with the effect that they become globally isolated.
Yep.
So they're in essentially a no-win position. If they join these other institutions which are currently parallel and which you point out are more representative of the global population and the world of nations, then that can only enhance the credibility and status of these other institutions. But of course, if it tries to freeze out these other institutions and pretend that they're not worthy of its own membership, then it just allows itself to be isolated, and pretty soon you have the Western Bloc with its own, little corner of ultra-corrupt institutions, and the rest of the world with almost a separate system. Yeah. And of course, if it allows them to develop a separate system, it can't try to rig it and steal from it.
That's right. And so what happens, you guys, I think, when we see this criminal government and this criminal banking cabal, which is in control of this government, start to lose its position as the most powerful player on planet Earth, it starts to appear as though the United States, the Pentagon, those in charge of our government, are behaving and are beginning to behave like rabid dogs. And tell me if this doesn't sound like propaganda coming out of Pravda circa like 1980, guys. This is from the Military Times. Let me read this to you. Defense Secretary Ash Carter says Russia, China potentially threaten global order. Defense Secretary Ash Carter on Saturday accused Russia of endangering world order, citing its incursions in Ukraine and loose talk about nuclear weapons, and said the U.S. defense establishment is searching for creative ways to deter Russian aggression and protect U.S. allies. I mean, does that sound to you like anything less than propaganda? Because we know that it's this government that put the corrupt puppet government in power in Ukraine. We know it's this government in NATO that is surrounding Russia with essentially first strike weapons that would knock down anything coming out of Russia, so that this nation could do a first strike and Russia would not be able to respond in kind. We know what's going on with Syria, and the Pentagon backing and supporting ISIS, which then Putin vows to destroy ISIS, and the Pentagon says, wait, no, don't do it. Please, wait, stop. I mean, this is...
You're exposing the lies.
Yeah, don't expose... Shh, wait, and then they say, you're potentially threatening the global order. Well, yeah, he's potentially threatening their new world order, right? Where it's the banksters and the U.S. government bank, it's the Federal Reserve banksters, the central banksters and their buddies that sit at the top. That's the global order that Russia and China are threatening.
Guys, I got to just step in for a second and say I hate that phrase "New World Order" so much.
And call it the old world order.
Who are we talking about? We're talking about the Rothschilds, and there's nothing new about that crime syndicate. This is the old world order, and of course, this new world order is just this disinformation mythology, this entire sphere of disinformation mythology, which they themselves have created to hide behind.
No, that's right.
If you're the old world order and you're trying to run the same crime syndicate, no better way to hide that crime syndicate than to tell everybody there's a new world order that's replacing it.
No, you're right, and that's a fair thing to point out. Absolutely, Jeff. But you know where that comes from, right? I mean, where it stays fresh in my mind is when Bush Sr. was president and spoke in speeches over 220 times mentioning the New World Order coming into focus. And who was Bush Sr. prior to becoming president? Well, he was the head of the CIA. I don't know. Is that the type of person we want running our government? And who was his father? Prescott Bush, who was engaged in a fascist coup of the U.S. government, and they recruited Smedley Butler to be a part of that, and Smedley Butler blew the whistle. And of course, none of the bad guys, none of the oligarchs ever go to jail, but that's all on the record. I mean, you got the Bush crime family talking about the New World Order, so that's why it sticks there with me. But you're absolutely right; it's the old world order.
It's just nothing but crime as far as the eye can see in the Western world, which is why the Western world, if our government on this side of the pond and on the other side of the pond, if the Western world in general doesn't develop a new business model and move away from war as a business model, then, as Jeff pointed out, we're going to become an island, and our systems will no longer function in the East. None of our monetary or financial systems will be accepted. They will be cut off. And where's that going to leave us? That's going to leave us even more impoverished, and then more enslaved by these criminal oligarchs that right now have us by the throat, and people don't even realize it.
Yeah. But I would, Jeff, jump in here. I know you got something to say, but I would say all by design, Rory. All by design. I've been bringing up the cover of the 1988 Economist magazine now in multiple interviews, just reminding people that Rothschild-managed magazine in 1988 predicted a new world currency in 2018. You know, with a phoenix rising from the flames of burning dollars and a gold coin around its neck that said 2018 on it. So I think this plan's been in place for a very, very long time. And making serfs out of the American people is probably all part of the plan, because if you make us serfs, we can't fight back.
Well, I was going to say, and sorry to cut you off there, Rory, in reference to your remarks about the U.S., a title for one of my upcoming commentaries is U.S. Dollar, the Barbarous Relic. And I point out how the dollar itself has been turned into a relic because it's been ridiculously debauched through the hyperinflationary money printing of the Federal Reserve, and it's been rendered worthless at the same time. So in monetary terms, it's a relic in every sense of the word. And of course, the United States has become a barbarous nation. It tortures people, it slaughters innocent civilians, detains and incarcerates people without anything remotely resembling due process. It's renounced the Geneva Conventions. It goes around destroying other nations. And the other thing I've gotten into with a recent commentary, Russia and China victory by default, is just to point out how we're seeing the pattern of a dying empire.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. And as you were saying, Sean, talking about it being a rabid dog, I mean, that's exactly what it is. I mean, our government has become, they're so desperate at this point that they're firing thermonuclear Trident missiles over California, not just once, but twice now. Is Russia doing that? But Russia's the bad guy.
Well, yeah, it is alarming. And you know what, the other thing that's alarming, you guys, I mentioned this in that Caravan to Midnight interview, that, now we see this tyranny by the United States government, even domestically, being overt. Well, it used to be covert. So many bad things were done covertly, and the American people would only find out decades later. Now it's so completely overt. And we know that Obama's Obamacare is destroying the middle class and raising insurance premiums to the point of being absolutely unaffordable beyond belief. We're seeing premiums, in some cases double or triple for families. That's absolutely unsustainable. So we have a liar who is now, he's got the audacity to address the TPP and tell us the greatest corporate power grab in history is the right thing for America. And he says about this secret trade deal, the inner workings of which have just been made public, and it's worse than anybody feared. And he says, I quote, "A trade deal that helps working families get ahead," right? In his opinion, the toughest global labor laws which will allow American workers to compete on a so-called level playing field, end quote. You know what the level playing field is? This has been revealed in the documents. It's competing with workers in Malaysia that make 65 cents an hour. That is the promise of this sorry, Jeff, New World Order and this corporatocracy, this oligarchy, this secret TPP corporate takeover, which will destroy the sovereignty of this nation. And this man has the audacity to get up there and tell people that it's going to be good for American workers, which is a bold-faced lie.
Well, we just have to look at the numbers. When since these trade deals first began to be imposed upon us, we've seen structural unemployment in the West increase by at least 50 million people. And that's a conservative number. Of course, we can't get precise numbers on unemployment because our governments do the best they can to hide the real numbers. But if you look at things like civilian participation rates, this is what we see. There's been at least an increase in 50 million more permanently unemployed people since these trading agreements began. And it gets worse and worse as they broaden the agreements. And of course, the point you make, Sean, is so crucial here when we talk about trade agreements. Real free trade can only exist on a level playing field where all nations have equalized wage structures, equalized working conditions, and equally important, equalized tax structures. Mm-hmm. Now, can you imagine if all of these corrupt governments ever tried to agree on a single tax structure? It's just ludicrous to try to imagine such a meeting. But that's what you need if you're going to have legitimate free trade. Everybody operating on a level playing field. And then we get what is the real economic concept in this principle of trading, which is, quote unquote, comparative advantage. Different nations are good at producing different goods or different raw materials, and on a level playing field, what you have are nations doing what they're good at and exporting that to nations who trade what they're good at. And of course, everybody wins in that system. But without the level playing field, we just get institutionalized corruption, where the only winners are the large corporations who are free to shift their operations to wherever they can get the cheapest slaves.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you just described, though, Jeff, isn't that sounds kind of like communism, isn't it?
Fascism.
Fascism?
Well, and
communism?
This is the point, though. We're of course saturated with hearing this ideological label communism, and the example that's always used is the Soviet Union. But there was nothing more fascist than the Soviet Union. It was, of course, there are parallels between fascism and communism, and that both systems are highly centralized. But true communism is supposed to be a system of imposed equality. And there was no imposed equality in the Soviet Union. They still had their classes, but they had a very small rich class and a very small upper class, and then vast numbers of poor. Well, that's not communism. That's fascism or feudalism, if you want to go back even further. But it's certainly not anything resembling what Karl Marx was describing when he created the doctrine of communism. So This is the whole point. We have this phony label that's continually thrown at us to confuse us from what we're really seeing. And of course, here in the West, we're told we've got quote unquote capitalism as they get more and more extremely fascist by the day.
Yeah, and fascism, we talk about fascism a lot, actually, Jeff, on when I do interviews and in articles, because this TPP, for example, is the greatest corporate power grab in history. Well, if it's a corporate power grab, that is the very definition of fascism, because the corporations are for it, they wrote it in secret, and the government, Obama, is pushing it. The marriage of the corporatocracy and government is the definition of fascism. And how do you maintain the sovereignty of your nation when your very president is promoting something as dastardly as the TPP, which benefits corporations and will destroy the sovereignty of our nation? You're right. It's the very definition of fascism. Here's a little quiz for you guys. This is an oft-heard quote. I'm going to read it for you, and then you guys can tell me who said it. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Who said that?
Is it Jefferson or Hamilton?
You got it.
I was guessing Jefferson too.
TJ.
Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. And and that's exactly what's happened. Here we are sitting now in 2015 looking at the potential end of the dollar here in the next, Jeff, in the last interview with you said in 5 years. There's no way this system can go on another 5 years.
And of course, we were talking about the gold standard, and conversely, the gold standard is the primary impediment to this process of destruction we're seeing. If the banking crime syndicate had not managed to convince the Nixon regime to abolish the last vestige of our gold standard, we could never have gotten as far as we've gone down the road to economic destruction.
How do we get out? How does Sean, Jeff, Rory, how do we get out?
Grassroots.
How do we make it stop? Because that's the only thing at this point that matters, because we see it, we know it. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to be steamrolled by these criminals? Am I going to allow myself and my family to be further enslaved? I need to take a stand. When do we start taking a stand? I mean, I understand that what we're doing right now is helping to get the message out and helping to educate people, but time is limited, as you just pointed out. 5 years, that's a blink of an eye. So we're talking about zero time to make something happen. That's my new question. What are we going to do about it?
Jeff, I'd like to hear your response to that. I would just say this. I think it's too late to turn the Titanic around. And I was saying on that interview with John B. Wells that collectively, we all have a lot of power. Even individually, we have power, right? We can extricate ourselves from the criminal banking system, not do business with their criminal banks, move your money to a credit union, get out of fiat dollars, get as much physical silver and gold as you can to not support the fiat dollar. Obviously, exercise your First Amendment rights, your Second Amendment rights. But as I said in that interview, there is going to be a line in the sand for every American person. For every American citizen, there will soon be a line in the sand. And I'm not sure what your line in the sand is, Rory, and I don't know what Jeff's is. Of course, he's up there in Canada. But everybody is going to have a line in the sand where they're going to have to draw that line, and they're going to have to choose to not comply. And the reason I brought that up is because clearly we can see them moving against the guns in the Second Amendment. And beyond that, if that doesn't resonate with you, they're pushing mandatory vaccinations with SB 277 in California. And people are freaking out because that is the absolute line in the sand for many people, especially those with children, that do not want a tyrannical fascist government to have the power of a state-sponsored needle. Right? And as I told a friend recently who asked me if I got a flu shot, and I went on a rant asking him why he got one, I told him about SB 277. He didn't know about it. And I said, look, this is a slippery slope into absolute despotism and total tyranny, right? Because even if you, like he does, trusts this government and believes everything this U.S. government does is benevolent, right? And they're looking out for you, and that's why they want to mandate vaccines. Even if you believe that to be true, it's a slippery slope to give the government blanket authority to mandate vaccinations nationwide, which is probably what they want, because even if this government's benevolent, who's to say the next one will be? And eventually there will be a tyrannical government that could just make everybody line up and get the shot because they say there was a biological event and you need to go to the post office or the local public school to get your shot, and God only knows what's in that shot. But they'll say, trust us, because you have to, because we're the loving, benevolent government. It's pure insanity, and people are freaking out, rightly so, about over SB 277 in California, because it is now precedent for them to try to move this out federally, because criminal Governor Jerry Brown signed it. And yeah, I'm ranting about this because I think it's extremely important. There are going to be lines in the sand now for American citizens individually, and it's going to come down to what you believe in how strong your moral code is, because collectively we have a lot of power. If we all choose not to comply together, the state has very little power.
Well, I wanted to address the remarks of both of you in general terms, but let me just take a moment to address your remarks about vaccination specifically, and just stress the horror that I felt when I first discovered the truth, which is that the pharmaceutical companies are legally allowed to push these drugs onto the market with much, much less testing than any other kind of pharmaceutical product. And of course, the excuse is that there's this need to get these vaccinations out as soon as possible, and thus they're exempted from proper testing requirements. So when you have drugs that are exempted from proper testing requirements and they're being forced onto the population, what could be a worse nightmare than that? Because of course it's so easy for the fascists to put something into one of these vaccinations and then claim after the fact that, oh, we had no idea that this was what this was going to do to the population.
Well, Jeff, do you know this, that in this country, they're also, the big pharma companies are exempted against lawsuits from those who have been injured by their vaccines?
And I mean, it's mind-boggling. In the land of
Terrifying.
litigation, it is mind-boggling that your government would carve out this massive facet of this whole litigation empire for the lawyers and say you can never touch this. Given how powerful the legal lobby is in of course the U.S. and Canada and most of the West, it just contemplate the sort of political pull required to perpetrate something like that. Mm-hmm. But I also want to get back to Rory's general remarks about how the system itself, like five years or so or less probably, is simply not enough time to really do much. And then your original remark about how there's no possibility of salvaging the system. So the point here is that obviously the fascists are aware of this, and so that's why they're creating this gigantic smokescreen, so that in the very limited amount of time left to us, things are too obscured for the people to properly unite, because we see today we have this ludicrously corrupt and entirely fascist top-down hierarchy in our societies, cannot be salvaged at all. So the only way to redeem such a system is in the opposite manner, through bottom-up grassroots activism. But how do you ever see that sort of coordinated behavior amongst the people when they're all kept in a state of confusion until it's too late to do anything?
Yep. Problem, reaction, solution. They just keep us all fighting against each other. They keep the left opposed to the right. They just keep us fighting with each other. They keep us distracted. Yeah, divide and conquer. You're right. And it's there's no better evidence of it, I thought, than when Ron Paul was running for president and he had more grassroots support than I'd really ever seen for anybody. Really, people just loved the guy, and he got more military donations than all of the other Republican candidates combined. And of course, the media buried it. The media buried him, and they lied about him, and they ignored him.
Shut him out of the campaign.
Shut him out of the campaign. They didn't want a libertarian president because the media corporation, the media talking heads, the Mockingbird media is all bought and paid for by the corporations. Now, I said again, and I don't mean to beat this to death, but I told John B. Wells this fascist coup of the U.S. government that Prescott Bush wanted back in the 30s with his Wall Street buddies, it happened. It probably happened when they shot Kennedy and that generation chose to do nothing about it, but it definitely happened for sure, signed, sealed, and delivered on 9/11. There's been a fascist coup and overtake of the U.S. government, and that's where we sit, and I'm not sure how we get it back. So on that sunny note,
yeah, we didn't come up with a lot of answers here, unfortunately. Just a lot more unpleasant questions.
Well, let's leave people with this then, guys. Is it? I mean, when you talk about all of these very, very serious issues, including nuclear war, the very potential for that, which Ash Carter is really openly talking about now, a nuclear exchange with Russia, calling them the aggressors. When we talk about all of this dire stuff, is it cliche to even mention physical precious metals at this point? Because clearly it's not gonna save the United States from economic calamity, but it might save you and yours from being a serf.
Well, we can't totally focus ourselves on trying to organize collectively and altruistically and forget about personal protection. Right. People cannot successfully organize if they're all in the poorhouse. And that's, of course, why in the Bankers' Manifesto of 1892, there's this quote that I like to trot out on a regular basis from the banksters: people without homes will not quarrel with their leaders. Mm-hmm. So we need to protect our economic liberty, because if we lose our economic liberty and become pure serfs, that dramatically reduces the possibility of us being able to successfully and effectively organize at the grassroots citizen level.
I love that term, economic liberty. That's a great way to end this, because it occurs to me as you say those words, Jeff, that's what Rory and me and you are focused on with our daily work. Economic liberty. It really is the one way for us all to exercise our personal power, because they're doing their very best to make us all feel worthless and unable to fight back. But you can exercise your economic and your personal liberty and try to protect yourself and your family. I think that was very well said, Jeff, and I appreciate that. Well, why don't we wrap it up,
Yes.
guys? Unless anybody has anything else, feel free to toss it out there. But if not, Rory and Jeff, take a turn each and tell us about your sites, and we'll wrap this up.
Well, I'm still doing the same thing I've been doing for the last couple of years, and of course, in the case of Bullion Bulls Canada, for about 7 years now, putting out commentaries, 1 or 2 a week on that site, and then I also provide Sprott Money with 1 original commentary a week in addition, and then they also publish my Bullion Bulls commentary. So that's my main operations, and then I'm fortunate enough to get coverage with other fine sites like SGT Report and the Daily Coin.
The Daily Coin is an aggregate news site, and I do quite a bit of writing. Try to write at least 2 articles a week. Try to conduct at least 1 interview a week. Hopefully more. I've also got working in the background. I'm working on a fairly large project that will hopefully be unveiled within the next few months. And just that's what I got going on. Just trying to keep people educated, and one thing that like I said, I really want to focus on is what can we do? What can we do to get out of this mess individually, because it won't be collectively.
Is your large project, Rory, is that building an off-planet ark that you can
It's an off-planet ark with a seed vault
like it.
and lots of weapons.
I like it. The USS Hall. No, it wouldn't be the USS, would it? It would be...
No, it wouldn't.
It needs to be something a little bit more libertarian and less fascist than USS. All right, my friends. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And guys, you can check us out at sgtreport.com. We're posting, 80 alternative news media stories a day there. Of course, my original content. And we do appreciate your support there, and at thelibertymill.com. And check us out at thephaser.com. We really do appreciate your support. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And if you like this one, hit the like button, will you? It's a good free way of supporting us and helping us spread the message. All right, guys. Have a terrific weekend ahead. And thanks again. Watch out for you and yours. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. God bless. Thanks, guys.
Bye.